Right now I'm chairman of the OECS, so that's from St. Kitts all the way down to Grenada. I have had the opportunity to physically fly into Anguilla, to the British Virgin Islands. I've been to St. Kitts, I've been to Antigua, and I've been as far north as Turks and Caicos.
And what have you seen?
It's obviously very, very bad. Obviously a lot of infrastructural damage. But I think it's important to put that in context, that this is not the first time that this has happened in the Caribbean. I mean, we had Hurricane Ivan back in 2004. It literally devastated the economies of Grenada and Cayman, and both of them have bounced back. Saint Lucia in 2010, Hurricane Thomas was very, very, very damaging, and we've bounced back. And so the resilience of the Caribbean is extremely strong, and that we are brothers and sisters. So whereas there may be other events taking place around the world and priority may not be on us, we have always bound together to be able to make this thing happen. What's interesting about what's taken place is the number of destinations that have been impacted. So you have the British with the British Virgin Islands, you have the US with the US territories, you have the Dutch and the French with Saint Martin. You now have yesterday Guadeloupe and Dominica being impacted. You have Puerto Rico that was being impacted. Then you had Houston that was out. You had Florida and Miami that were potentially going to be in the path. And then you had an earthquake in Mexico and another earthquake, unfortunately, last night. And my heart and prayers go out to the citizens of Mexico and the Mexican government. So it's in essence been a bit of a perfect storm that's been taking place.
With all of that, I know that here in the United States, the focus was very much first on Houston and the surrounding areas, and then on Florida. What kind of efforts and attention have you received in the Caribbean?
Well, because of the dependence being impacted so severely, the U.S. were very quick to respond in St. Thomas and St. John's. The British were down in Anguilla and the British Virgin Islands, though most people would say that that recovery has been very slow. And then you obviously had the French and the Dutch being preoccupied in Saint Martin. So people like the Florida Caribbean Cruise Association, that is Carnival and Royal Caribbean, have been extremely responsive. The Venezuelan government also have been extremely responsive because the support has had to come from the south. Because, you know, while we were going through this, you had 2 hurricanes heading up north, and literally Miami was on a shutdown. So unfortunately, American hub got shut down almost for 10 days out of Miami. And so it really has shown us that we need to diversify ourselves a bit and maybe look a bit more to Panama in terms of supplies of food, because, you know, the Caribbean is one of the few regions in the world in which the U.S. has a trade surplus. We're talking about almost $5.6 billion trade surplus. The Caribbean is an important part of America's security. So if you look from Trinidad all the way to the Bahamas, and each one of us has this 500-mile economic zone that we have to take care of. And if you connect all that blue economy, the Caribbean is actually larger than Mexico. And so that's the kind of space that we're left with to help secure.
Right. We've had a somewhat provocative debate on this set over the past week about insurance and insuring people who live in the Caribbean, on islands like yours, in the Florida Keys, whether there should be some kind of private market solution to this, whether it should be priced properly, and perhaps that it isn't. What do you think of that?
I think it's a great idea, but in order for that to take place, building up resilience. So, you know, in the world today, there's 2 terms that people are using. One's called mitigation, which is the reduction of carbon emissions, and the other one's adaptation, which is physically building the infrastructure to cope with these storms. So basically accepting this is a new reality. And I think that the insurance mechanism will work very, very well, but it's going to require some changes in order to ensure that the infrastructure is built back up, because nobody wants to know that every single time there's a storm, we're starting back at zero.
You've made the point that there are some rules that make it much tougher for middle-income or high-income islands to get any share of rebuilding money when storms like this come through. What are those rules, and what would you like to see happen?
Well, basically, the IMF and the World Bank have decided that they're going to classify specifically everybody based on per capita GDP. And we've been arguing that there are 53 countries that we call SIDS, small developing states. You know, Saint Lucia has an economy of 1.5 billion, a population of 170,000, you know. The Solomon Islands, Tonga, all of us are very, very small. And we're saying that you cannot classify us just by per capita GDP. And that vulnerability has to be a more broadly accepted term. So If in fact, well, if it remains the way it is now, when we're rebuilding, we can only get access to what we call commercial rates because we're considered middle income. And if you're now a high income, so for instance, Antigua is on the verge of becoming a high income country, we'll get just pure commercial rates. So we're arguing that when it comes to infrastructural development, that the World Bank agreed to reclassify us as lesser developed countries. And therefore we get access to concessional funds, low interest rate funds, longer term repayments.
Because you're dealing with these issues that are coming fast and furiously.
Absolutely. And the second thing that we're trying to put in place, if in fact we do have a trade surplus with the U.S., as an example of 5.3 billion, our economies haven't begun to mature yet. So the opportunity for the U.S. companies to benefit is even greater. And I think that we can all agree here, if we can get a private sector-led initiative, it's going to be much longer lasting. So we've seen that we had the Caribbean Basin Initiative when Reagan was in. And one of the components was twin planting. And Puerto Rico was a huge beneficiary under the 936 regime. Can we not get an incentive, and that's what we're in discussions with the U.S. about, that if U.S. companies invest into the Caribbean, that those investments in our books are always tax-free, that the U.S. allow those funds to be repatriated back into the U.S. tax-free only on those investments. So one, it accomplishes getting the funds back into the United States of America. It creates an avenue for the private sector to participate in this growth and brings a lot of money to the table.
If there's a tax reform, some of this would be a moot point, correct? This is assuming that U.S. tax law remains unchanged?
No, I think it's regardless. So for instance, United States has NAFTA with Mexico and Canada.
So this would be our own trade agreement?
For the Caribbean. I mean, the Caribbean used to be what we call part of the three borders. And what happened after 9/11, the U.S. changed it that Americans needed passports to travel. So prior to that, Americans did not need passports to go to Mexico, Canada, or the Caribbean. So it means that we had access to 100% of the market, and everybody else had only access to 8% of the market. So I understand why we lost that, but it's about putting something in place to replace it, because the principle of maintaining a secure Caribbean still remains.
CAFTA, our own version of it. Prime Minister Chastanet, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And again, my heart goes out to my citizens and my nationals in Dominica. Obviously, we're getting some initial reports back right now, which are not pretty. But again, we're all in this together, and we're going to make sure that Dominica comes back stronger and better than before.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.